Hello, and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Max Perry. I'm an independent journalist based in Baltimore, Maryland. I'll be your host for the day. And joining me, as always, from Eugene, Oregon, is my co-host and our producer, Shaenah Batterson. Hey, Shaenah.
Hi, Max. It's good to be back doing another episode.
Yeah, everyone, Shaenah is a writer as well, and both of us are actually currently featured in Covert Action magazine, where you can read both of our work. Shaenah also has a Substack that's called The Red Letter that everyone should check out as well. So that's where you can follow our work at Cam and her Substack. So this week, we wanted to discuss another aspect of Western imperialism that's an important aspect to it in terms of propaganda. And I think it's relevant, even with recent events like this past week saw the United States and Russia hold a very important summit in Anchorage, Alaska, between the two respective heads of state, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And there have been a variety of takes given about how much progress or lack thereof was made in these peace negotiations. It seems like Zelensky rejected the security guarantees that Russia was offering, but I'm honestly a little bit unclear as to where everything stands as far as that goes. But I think regardless of what one's take was on that summit, I think it's pretty difficult not to see it as a pretty big resounding strategic defeat for the United States. And, as far as this proxy war that's been waging, using Ukraine as a cat's paw for Western imperialism. And I think the talks that took place where Russia seemingly is dictating the terms, I mean, they're the clear winner here. Pretty emblematic of the decline of American global hegemony. And today, I want to discuss a very important subject as it relates to American imperialism and one of the ways in which it propagandizes, including during the Ukraine war. There's been a number of instances of war propaganda, obviously, and the U.S. and the Western imperialist countries, they do this to justify their uh, their support for waging this proxy warfare, and that I'm referring to is the weaponization of human rights specifically to justify these policies and interventions. And of course, also happening right now, I can't go without mention the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which has really exposed, the complete failure of the so-called international community really to do anything to stop probably the biggest violation of human rights in recent history that I can think of. I mean, perhaps even since the Second World War, in what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza. And the UN, which is a very politicized organization, you can see their hypocrisy in the difference between the way that, Russia's been treated versus Israel. I mean, although, Israel has become a pariah on the world stage, largely because of its own doing, there's just a double standard as far as the way that Israel is able to get away with this. The fact that the U.S. kills every resolution for a ceasefire because it's a permanent member of the Security Council. But as far as like going back to the creation of Israel, everyone knows the UN from the outset was complicit in its very creation. But the way that it's failed to hold Israel accountable to adopt resolutions that could achieve a ceasefire or address the humanitarian crisis has shown how completely bankrupt an institution it is. And I wanted to talk about the way that Western imperialism has weaponized human rights. And I think that the best term I've ever heard for it, there's a Cuban-born lawyer named Alfred de Zayas, if I'm saying his name correctly, but he's worked for many years in the field of international law and human rights, and I've watched interviews with him. And for several years, he was actually appointed by the Human Rights Council as a independent expert, and he served at the UN for 6 years. And since then, he's gone on to talk about how he calls it the human rights industry, and I think that's a very fitting subject line for what we wanted to talk about today. And that's coming from someone that worked at the UN and saw from the inside just how the sausage gets made. And he's very forthcoming about how he was, the UN Human Rights Council, more or less, as an institution, is in the service of empire, in the service of Washington and Brussels, and how, as an international body, the UN and its very institutional structure has been hijacked in service of the West, to score. It's used to score political points against by the U.S. to score points against its geopolitical rivals. Um,
Yeah, can I add something about that really quickly? It's pretty funny. I recently learned because, a lot of the Western human rights organizations, they are particularly critical of China usually. And I learned apparently in China, there are human rights organizations that are critical of the US because of its structural racism and police violence and these other things. So it's just funny to me that they're giving it right back, so to speak.
yeah, I mean, I think that they had it. The U.S. sort of invites that. I mean, I think that goes back to we discussed that documentary about how the CIA used jazz music during the Cold War for soft power against the USSR. And one of the most memorable moments in that documentary is when Nikita Khrushchev goes to the UN, and the US and was criticizing the USSR for being a one party, dictatorship or whatever. And Khrushchev was saying, "Who are you to criticize us when look at your treatment of your own uh, population, specifically African Americans at the time?" So, and this is when the US and the USSR were competing for influence in the African continent as it was decolonizing. So I think the way that China engages in a tit for tat, has been it's been a longstanding thing with the geopolitical rivals of the U.S. to, because the U.S.'s own I mean, what was it? Martin Luther King said it was the biggest violator of human rights in the world,
Which is,
his own government, famous
which,
quote from him.
I mean, especially even if you just put aside the things the United States does at home. Like you could even say, going back with I can't remember, like in the 60s, the how black women were going in for surgeries and then being sterilized without their knowledge and all this sorts of stuff. But even if you just exempt that, I mean, if you just look at the sorts of movements that the CIA supports abroad, like terrorist fundamentalists and these other sorts of things, that alone is very much, you could argue, human rights violations.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be getting into some of that a little later when we discuss the white helmets. But I mean, the UN really, I think, in its very structure, I mean, the Security Council, especially, has been used by the United States, which is a permanent member, to, as I was saying, veto the resolutions, for example, on a ceasefire in Gaza, which is one of the main reasons the genocide has just gone on uninterrupted now for almost 2 years. I mean, years ago, I remember Hugo Chavez proposed restructuring the UN Security Council so there would be greater or more equitable representation as far as the global South goes. But obviously, that never came to be. On the one hand, it's a good thing, obviously, that China and Russia are permanent members as well, which has prevented maybe some of the worst things the U.S. has wanted to do. But I mean, not the Iraq War, obviously, and numerous other examples, but I mean, very frequently the U.S. doesn't even go to the UN for permission, like with Libya or in the Balkans. I mean, they just didn't even they just used NATO and went around unilaterally. But I think it really has to do as far as like the inherent Western bias in the UN. I think it really has to do with its very foundation, because if you look when it was established in the post World War II international situation. I mean, not to mention the fact that the Western countries, especially the United States, have historically exerted significant financial influence within the UN system. But like with its very establishment, I mean, the US emerged as a superpower after World War II, obviously, and I think the UN is sort of inherently biased toward the West because, the way that it was established on the basis of, purported Western ideals and principles, which of course are not what they claim to be. But I think that that really lends itself to the way that, you've seen the way that the US tries to impose, freedom and democracy on the colonized developing world and on
Well,
regions and cultures that may have different belief systems or are not receptive to this idea that Western liberal democracy, is the only way to govern, and it's the only acceptable political system, and that we are have this, divinely appointed mission to like go out and civilize the rest of the world that doesn't adhere to, Western liberal democracy. I think,
yeah, that's a great point. And the West, oftentimes with these countries that have human rights violations, the West is measuring the country's social and economic systems and political system against itself, against, you know, Western liberal democracy. And but I mean, in a sane, rational world, it would make much more sense to measure the country against what it was in the past. Is it an improvement upon what it was? And or is it a regression? And besides, it is this very much sort of presumptuous attitude that the West has often had that, this way is the only way, instead of recognizing the different flavors of different cultures and different societies.
yeah, and when, countries have adopted democracy and the electoral process doesn't go the US's way. I mean, obviously, like Mossadegh being elected. I mean, the fact that they make such a huge deal about the fact that, that Iran is not a real democracy, it's under the control of the Ayatollah. Uh, but then you go back, or even under Assad, like in Syria. I mean, you go back and look, both Syria and Iran. I think in Syria it was in the late 40s, but then most famously Iran in the early 50s when Mossadegh was elected. The U.S. engages in coups and overthrows people when they are, not its preferred choice. Or I mean, the when Arab nationalists particularly, got elected, they made sure to meddle and overthrow them. I mean, so like these regions of the world, like the Middle East, like that, this whole myth that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, very frequently when countries like Iran did adopt, quote unquote democracy, the US and the outcome was not what the US
Mhm.
wanted. They just interfered. And so, and actually,
Oh,
in
well, sorry to cut you off, but I mean, Trump just issued like $50,000 bounty for Maduro, a Venezuelan, because he was reelected, was it last year?
yeah, and they try and claim that it's, I mean, they since Chavez, they've been claiming that, that the Chavistas, there's the elections are illegitimate, but there have been international observers. I think even Jimmy Carter's election monitoring organization, at least I don't know about under Maduro, but under Chavez, they always said that the elections were totally free and I mean fair and free of corruption and whatnot. But yeah, I mean they tried to say that Maduro is a dictator and that the election was illegitimate. But I mean, at this point, I mean, they said that about Evo Morales. They say it about anybody that,
Dic
doesn't play ball with the US. So,
well, yeah, we think, that's what it seems in the mainstream media. What dictator means is that any leader who doesn't just automatically do what the US wants them to do, oh, they're a dictator.
I mean, yeah, the US supports numerous studies have shown the US supports most of the world's dictatorships, including some of the absolute worst ones, like Saudi Arabia, for example. But I mean, this illusion that people have, I mean, getting back to the UN, that it's a neutral arbiter in international conflicts is simply false and fails to recognize, the class dynamics at play around the world. Which is why Lenin, in regards to the UN's predecessor, I mean, all you have to do to understand the UN's function is look at its predecessor, the League of Nations, which Lenin called the den of thieves, because the whole concept of a world institution to manage international affairs is inextricably wrapped up in imperialism. I mean, the League of Nations was established in 1919 after World War One, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and it mandated at the time the carving up of the European continent between the victorious imperialist powers, and the League of Nations was set up to oversee the dividing up of territories. And if you go back and look, it was camouflaged under these same sort of hypocritical proclamations of support of the rights of self-determination. I mean, meanwhile, they were also dividing up, the Middle East. I mean, amongst the colonial powers, entire regions of the world were given mandate, including, Palestine under the British, to they were mandated to dominant league members, Britain and France, for example, as I was saying, were basically gifted most of the Middle East. So of course, self-determination really meant autonomy for the wealthy colonial nations and exploitation for the oppressed countries, which is why it's very important in understanding the Marxist conception of imperialism, to look at how Lenin made this distinction between oppressor and oppressed nations, because it's just indispensable to understanding the Marxist uh, conception of imperialism. But everything about the League of Nations can be applied to the UN today. Um, and as far as like its purported mission of human rights goes, I mean it goes way beyond the United Nations, but because there's a whole, like Alfred de Zayas was saying, a human rights industry, and there's a whole constellation of human rights, NGOs and aid agencies that are part of this Western, you know, I mean, I would call it humanitarian imperialism. It's part of that machine. And, these organizations like the UN, they receive funding from private and government donors. Most of these big NGOs, the US government frequently being the largest benefactor. But actually, I think before we get into the sort of specific NGOs, I want to talk about like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International specifically. But before we get into that, I think we should address, the whole notion of human rights and liberal democracy on a theoretical or philosophical basis, because it's sort of key to understanding how there's just a inherent contradiction there. And it sort of reinforces this idea that an institution like the UN can serves as this function of being like the world's mediator and manager of international affairs, when it's clearly slanted towards the Western imperial powers. But I think that the whole notion of human rights and liberal democracy really goes back to the French Revolution. Did you want to talk about that, Shaenah?
Sure. Yeah, as I would say that the French Revolution, sort of occurred at this time as feudalism was falling away and capitalism was coming up, and the bourgeoisie were sort of contending with the entrenched power of the aristocracy, and merely by the economic structure of feudal society, because it was based on, serfs and unfree labor, so to speak, would not lend itself to a doctrine of human rights, as you'd say, but capitalism would, because it is based on wage labor. So the very basis of that society needs like free citizens, or, well, as free as you can be with the way capitalism is structured. But I would say that more so than just, I mean, I would say that the radical wing of the French Revolution, the Jacobins, and
Hmm.
their push for the abolition of slavery in the colonies, that did more for the cause of human rights in the universal sense of the term than just how it has been painted, because I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
No, I know what you're saying because I think, I mean, as far as like the legacy of the French Revolution goes, I mean, Robespierre is like, I think, kind of like Stalin, kind of like one of the most you know, demonized historical figures, almost more like even more so than like Napoleon, but like, I mean, like Macron, like very controversially, obviously, though. I mean, he like laid a wreath at, Napoleon's tomb, but you're never going to see him do that for Robespierre, even though, the I mean, France claims to uphold these ideals that the French Revolution achieved, but like Robespierre is, and the Jacobins are really demonized because of the, the terror, and there's, this focus on how all the purges that happened at the time, that there were these mass killings that came after the revolution, and completely forgotten is the fact that, Robespierre was the one that pushed to free the slaves in Saint Domingue and the colonies. And Napoleon, when he came to power, he reinstituted slavery, and then the war was transformed, and the Revolutionary Wars became uh, the French Empire became expansionist, and many of those ideals were reversed, and later you had the Paris Commune, much later. But I think that I mean, liberal democracy. I mean, I think it has this rhetoric of liberty and human rights, but I think that from the beginning it's been used to justify and obscure mass oppression, including something like slavery and
Yeah,
colonialism and genocide, and that it's instead of it purports to be an ideology of universal freedom, but
well,
there's just an inherent contradiction that that sort of there's a built-in exclusion and subjugation of others if you look at it
well,
just
that's,
historically.
I mean, that's historically what it was, is it is freedom and liberty, but for this limited sphere, this, the white male property owning class. And as time has went on, other groups have struggled for inclusion in that sphere. So you would say that almost more that the groups struggling for inclusion in that sphere advanced the cause of human rights more than just the original structure of liberal democracy. But also, I would say, like what you were saying about Robespierre versus Napoleon, what I've noticed, and is, to borrow some concepts from Domenico Lacerdo, is that he talks about, so there's natural despecification and politico-moral despecification. Natural despecification meaning you target or dehumanize a group of people based on something like their sex or their race. And political moral meaning you do so based on their politics or class position, something of their choosing, really more so. But
Mhm.
it is painted that systems and societies that, they participate in what you could say is natural despecification, like the United States with slavery, or other like Britain with um its colony in India. That is painted, that's okay. But whenever a country begins on a campaign of political moral despecification, like the Bolshevik Revolution, that is no longer, that's then a violation of human rights. But it's not a violation of human rights do you see what I'm trying to say? That this
Or
narrative
that
is
they,
constructed.
or now it's sort of like the violence that occurred in something like the French Revolution, the revolutionary violence, the terror, that's sort of equated with slavery. Like there's the decontextualization or the depoliticization of the violence. They're put on equal footing, and it just becomes this abstract notion of human rights, um, without any context. And that's sort of the way that human rights now is weaponized, I think.
Yes, and that the point about the violence, it, because people go, oh, well, we want to support nonviolence, and it's just all violence is equalized. But if you were to boil it down to a very personal level, let's say you have like a rapist and abuser who's then doing violence to a woman, and then she does violence to put a stop to him abusing her. That's two very qualitatively different types of violence. And when you expand that out to a larger societal scale, like the violence of a country invading another country and enslaving the population is different than the inhabitants of a country rising up to throw off their colonial overlords. It's not the same thing, and it can't be equated.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lacerdo's big point is that there's this emancipatory rhetoric and these ideals of freedom and democracy. But if you look at the actual history, I mean, that's why he proposes a counter history, liberalism, a counter history, one of his main books. Because if you look at the historical record of liberal democracy, it's quite it's it's at odds with its rhetoric. And the only way to have a more authentic, or to reach a more authentic universal emancipation, which is something that the anti-colonial movement struggled for. um, that's the only way it can be achieved, is by acknowledging that history, the dark side of liberalism, that its thinkers have historically tried to ignore or repress. And I think, like, focusing on the terror of the Jacobins, or focusing on the terror that happened in the Russian Revolution, that's one of the ways it's done that. And
Well, exactly, because these movements, like for example, the Bolshevik Revolution or anti-colonial struggles, have opened up the sphere of what I was saying, like the sphere of human rights to a more universal sense of including more people, you could say. I'm not putting this very well, but
no, I think that's, I mean,
because the original liberal democracy, ruling the white ruling class, the only reason why it has been expanded to include more people is because of oftentimes violent struggles and revolutions occurring in other places in the world. It hasn't, just been granted out of the goodness of their heart, one could say. And it's actually interesting too, if you look at the history of the suffragettes. A lot of it was wealthy white women. They wanted to get in on what, their husbands would be in on with voting. But a lot of times they're often racist and ignored, the working class, like working class men who didn't own property. They couldn't vote. and obviously black people couldn't vote. So I would really say that something like the October Revolution did more for human rights than the suffragettes did, merely by the fact of opening a sphere of inclusion to more people in a more universal sense.
Yeah, and like you were saying, under the Russian Empire, obviously, uh, it was not a democracy. So
Mm,
to,
mm.
I mean, the Bolsheviks introduced the most democratic structures, and, I mean, really more like direct democracy that, I mean, just in the very fact that most of the population were uneducated peasants. I mean, and I mean, it was a very culturally backwards, largely agrarian-based society that most of the population was illiterate. You know, the very fact that they were educating people, introducing an education system and, workers' councils and all that. Okay, well, the fact that what came before the Russian Revolution was not a democratic system by any means, is just completely lost in the whole conversation. It's just that, there was one party rule and that's it. There's nothing as far as looked at as far as the very real progressive things that they did introduce. But I think that the United Nations, getting back to that, in the same way, it doesn't really promote true emancipation, just like liberal democracy purports to, because the United Nations primarily serves the interests of capitalist and imperialist states, and is an instrument of the global capitalist system and a product of the wealthier countries, especially the United States. And any humanitarian, you know, claims that it purports to have are really superficial, are really superficial fixes that, you know, it's designed to perpetuate a global system of exploitation, and the real geopolitical power is concentrated in the hands of the dominant imperialist powers, and the UN is just another imperialist tool to advance that system, and just reinforce it. It's dominated by the United States in its very structure, and the UN is just something that it uses to further its, Western imperial economic and political interests, uh, and extend its control over the global South. And Alfred Dessaias talks about the way that human rights specifically is used by the U.S. and European countries to accuse its rivals, be it Russia or China or Venezuela or whomever it is, of violating fundamental rights and freedoms, in order to engage in interventionism. Meanwhile, countries that have egregious human rights records that happen to be aligned with the United States are not held up to the same scrutiny, whether it's the Gulf monarchies or Israel. And more importantly, it uses human rights to portray those interventions as something noble, or to disguise their imperial aims. I mean, this gets into the whole notion of humanitarian interventionism, or
Well, that's
so-called responsibility to protect. And there's just a galaxy of human rights NGOs and an entire industry that exists, which helps enforce this geopolitical order where the West dominates, and the US is the world's policeman. And human rights is one of the main propagandistic weapons that they wield in order to do this. And that's, where these
what
organizations get their funding, who sits on their advisory and executive boards, bears a huge influence
well, I
on
think that
means.
that's the problem. You can't, in a class society, there isn't universal human rights. And the phrase human rights just it becomes a weapon of propaganda because it is kind of a universal and a bit nebulous of a term, but then it
Mhm.
can be used in many ways.
Yeah, I mean the perfect example is what's happening with Israel and Gaza, because like a lot of these human rights NGOs, they'll do reports about how Israel is, uh, you know, I mean, even Amnesty International says Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, I believe. I mean, everyone recognizes this except for the U.S. Um, but or like even like the ICJ, or they issue when they issued warrants for Netanyahu, they also issued warrants for the leaders of Hamas. Like, and one can get into the discussion about Hamas, the fact that they're Islamists, the fact that they were largely created by Israel funding them in the first place, to counter the PLO and the secular Arab nationalists and the Marxists. But leave that aside for a second. The idea that, like October 7th, the violence that took place there, even though it's questionable how much Hamas even did any of it. I mean, it seems like some of it was done by Israel too, against their own people. But like, even if you assume that Hamas did everything that they said they did on October 7th, and then you compare it with what um, Israel has done since, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, uh, deliberately starving them, bombing every single hospital in Gaza. I mean, you can go on and on. Even if what Hamas is doing is technically quote unquote terrorism, but they are, and put aside their Islamist character for a second, what they are doing is resisting a colonial occupation. They as even Hamas are civilians resisting an occupation, even if they are quote unquote a terrorist organization. The idea, the whole aim of something like Amnesty International issuing a report, issuing reports denouncing what Israel's doing as genocide in Gaza, and then turning around and also equating the violence by Hamas, putting them on equal footing. It serves this function of just reducing the whole conflict to just about violence taking the lives of innocent people or whatever. And it serves this depoliticization function to where, Western liberals can just sit back in the comfort of the West and make this false equation between the two sides that they're both bad. And it just perpetuates this narrative, that we need a two-state solution and all this BS. Like it really
Well,
serves a very sinister function, while on the surface, claiming to defend human rights, it has this other ulterior motive that, and you can see why, at the end of the day, it really ends up actually helping Israel do what it's doing, really, if you ask me. I
I
mean, it's good that they're documenting the human rights violations that Israel's committing. That's all well and fine, but you're sort of undoing any good work that is being done when you're equating the resistance, the legitimate resistance, whatever anyone wants to say about Hamas, because it's a total false equivalency.
well, I think there's historical echoes of the of French Algeria and the Algerian Revolution. There was a lot of violence there, but what was this violence? It was a violence in response to years and years of colonial occupation.
Yeah, I mean, and they're, yes, Hamas, I mean, they are Islamists, but, even the Marxists, the PFLP, they've committed suicide bombings. I mean, yeah, I mean, again, like, this is a very extreme situation where people are in such subjugation that they're resorting to terrorist violence, but it needs to have a context. If you remove the fact that they are an oppressed people living under occupation where they have no democratic means, no, they can't fucking vote their way out of being, being occupied by Israel. I mean, Israel's been occupying the Gaza Strip since 1967. I mean, this is ridiculous. They refuse to budge an inch on anything. They've have just been they're committing genocide, and these people are resisting. I mean, whatever their political character is at this point is just completely irrelevant. Um, and that's the unfortunate function. And there's a revolving door between a lot of these uh, NGOs like whether it's Amnesty International or International Rescue Committee or Human Rights Watch or any of the others you want to name, there's a revolving door on the advisory boards of these groups with these hawkish DC foreign policy think tanks. All these NGOs are highly politicized organizations with enormous conflicts of interest. You have people who are policymakers, then serving on the boards of these human rights organizations. I mean, if you look at the origins of some of them, Human Rights Watch, for example, was originally founded the Helsinki Watch Committee back in 1978 as an American-based NGO that was designed to monitor the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, whether they were adhering to human rights. And then after the Cold War ended, it rebranded itself and it expanded its repertoire, to monitoring countries globally. Like a lot of these NGOs, it got its seed funding from the Ford Foundation, and it's never, discarded its close ties to the Western establishment. I mean, all you have to do is just look at its leadership's affiliations, where it gets its funding from, and the role that it served over the years. And Human Rights Watch, at times, because it claims to have this institutional commitment to human rights, it has done some good work. Like, for example, in the 80s, it reported on like the human rights violations of the Reagan administration's support for death squads in Latin America, for the Contras, and all the human rights abuses that were happening in Nicaragua and other places. But that's also the problem with these NGOs, is that they do some legitimate work. Um, it's not that everyone that works there is in on this. I think a lot of people get involved in this kind of work hoping to do good. Um, but the legitimate work that they do provides cover for the other stuff that they do. And
It's very similar to USAID.
yeah, which is a government agency, which has the same sort of function. And that's another thing, that was created by the Kennedy administration. And it gives legitimacy to the propaganda that they also do. And
Exactly.
Human Rights Watch, time and time again, has thrown its support behind the U.S. government's agenda, to this point where very often they've become basically like a public relations arm of the foreign policy establishment. And this has been the case since the early 90s. I mean, Human Rights Watch has played a destructive role in some of the biggest contests in which the U.S. has been involved, in Iraq and the former Yugoslavia. In the lead up to the Iraq War, for example, the CEO of or the executive director of Human Rights Watch for many years, his name is Kenneth Roth. I think he left a few years ago. Um, but I remember, I mean, during the lead up to the Iraq War, he published this op-ed entitled "Indict Saddam," which didn't warn against launching an illegal war of aggression in violation of the UN Charter, which the Bush administration clearly wanted to do. And of course, in this op-ed, he didn't mention the fact that the sanctions that the U.S. had placed on Iraq had contributed to the deaths of an estimated 500,000 children, that Madeleine Albright family said was worth it. In this op-ed, he simply proposed indicting Saddam for war crimes that he'd committed against the Kurds in the 80s, as an alternative to military action. But thereby, thereby at the same time, he's providing further justification for military action. He's saying, don't take military action, but here's why we should indict him for war crimes. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure he's not going to give himself up voluntarily. And how could that possibly be achieved without prosecuting a war? I mean, Human Rights Watch said nothing when the U.S. bombed Serbia in 1999 using depleted uranium. When they do criticize Israel, like I was saying, they always make sure to equate the crimes of Hamas or Hezbollah or whomever. Their primary function is to reduce everything to this abstract notion of human rights. without any context to anything. And I mean, Amnesty International is another great example of one of these organizations that, on the one hand, might produce critical reports on the Israeli genocide in Gaza or the Saudi war on Yemen. But then, under this veil of impartiality, puts out its very questionable findings on governments targeted for regime change by Washington, be it whether it's Venezuela or Iran or North Korea. And it's not that there aren't human rights abuses going on in these places, is that it's that it ends up aiding these demonization campaigns to basically like soften up these countries for Western military intervention. And Amnesty International in particular.
Wait, let me add. If there's anything that's a violation of human rights, I would say it's military, just the Western military interventions that have occurred.
Yeah, and it's this self-appointed you know, enforcement position like that we have a
The
right to
white
do.
man's burden.
Yeah. I mean, Amnesty International has this very highly esteemed reputation as a defender of human rights around the world. But like Human Rights Watch, which was Helsinki Watch, if you look at the origins of Amnesty International, like many of these NGOs, it has actually has links to the intelligence community. And Amnesty International is headquartered in the UK, and has historically has ties to the British Foreign Office. It was founded in the early 60s by a lawyer or barrister named Peter Benenson. And like they have this whole story that they give that he was like on the tube in London, and he was reading a newspaper article about these two um, Portuguese students who were given like a really long prison sentence, I think like 8 years for drinking a toast to liberty or freedom or something. And uh, at the time, of course, you know, Portugal was under a fascist military dictatorship under Salazar. And this guy, Peter Benenson, he claimed he read this article about these two prisoners of conscience and he was disturbed by it. And he decided to launch this organization to wage campaigns for prisoners of conscience around the world, but and also to be impartial. The wage campaigns for prisoners of conscience, whether it's in the East or the West or in the global South. And you know, the fact that it was, I mean, this is particularly ironic because Salazar's regime, of course, was, I mean, a lot of its human rights violations were because it was staunchly anti-communist. I mean, that's who a lot of these people being thrown in prison were. But so was this guy, Peter Benenson. And he actually had a British military intelligence background. But Amnesty International, he was formed with this pledge that its stance would be apolitical and neutral and that it would represent prisoners of conscience around the world. The problem is the early 60s, this was at the exact moment when the British were withdrawing from its former colonies abroad. They were very concerned about the Soviet influence in these parts of the world that were, you know, newly gaining their independence. And apparently the British intelligence services started infiltrating and providing covert funding to Amnesty International during its early years. And there's also reports that Amnesty censored its own findings of human rights abuses in places that were still held by the British, like Yemen, in order to please the British government. And then in the mid 60s, there was a big scandal when this one particular Amnesty International volunteer was in Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe, which was a British colony that was ruled by a white settler minority, you know, of European descendants. I think it was like 5% of the population. was white, but yet they held all the political power. And while this volunteer was there, I think the British government and the Rhodesian government were sort of at odds with how, Britain decoupling from its colony and who the political power would be handed to. There was a conflict there because obviously the majority wanted rule, namely being the native black population, but obviously the 5%, the white settler minority wanted to hold on to power. So, but so anyway, this Amnesty International volunteer was there, and this volunteer started noticing there was a big discrepancy between the amount of money that was being poured into its campaigns and the scale of their operations there. And then this individual started raising questions about where the money was coming from, what the source was. And eventually, this person discovered that it was coming from the British government, which had effectively bought off the organization. And this was obviously at odds with its mission statement. It claimed to be apolitical. And there it is getting funny money from the British Foreign Office. And this guy, Peter Benenson, the founder, he claimed they were getting money because the British government wanted to help the political prisoners, and the British government didn't want this to come out for political reasons because they didn't want to offend the the Rhodesian government. But that's total bullshit. The woman who blew the whistle on this, whose name is Polly Toynbee, you can look her up. She said they were getting all this money and they were sitting around drinking and like entertaining the media when they were supposed to be helping detainees. And then they were at the same time getting assurances from like the Rhodesian government that the prisoners were okay. And also, this was also, she was also in Nigeria, I believe, as well as Southern Rhodesia. These places the Rhodesian government actually just declared independence unilaterally, like the white settler minority government. And they were going around rounding up the black nationalists who wanted real independence, with majority rule. They didn't want them to declare independence still ruled by the settlers. And you definitely know this is bullshit because around the same time, Amnesty International had actually withdrawn its support for Nelson Mandela in South Africa as a prisoner of conscience.
Wow.
In the beginning, they had pledged solidarity when he had incited workers to go on strike, and he went to prison for that. But it's clear that Amnesty, they were being manipulated and influenced by British intelligence when they changed their policy, withdrawing their support for him, and he was given a life sentence. And this gets into the depoliticization that we're talking about because Nelson Mandela did not renounce the use of violence as a means of political resistance with the African National Congress. So this same, scenario can be applied to what's going on with Hamas or the Palestinians. I mean, they're this, people have to reconcile with whether there is legitimate violence. I mean, this country was founded on a revolution. So, I mean, Amnesty International, they did continue to call for him to be for Nelson Mandela to be treated humanely. And they later engaged with him in his later years and whatnot. And he thanked them for campaigning for him. But the organization, its core principle was to only advocate on behalf of prisoners who didn't use violence. So you
Yep.
can see the political implications for this, for its role in conflicts in places, whether it's South Africa or Palestine or Ireland, and also why the intelligence services would want to subvert these kind of groups and find it useful for its propaganda. And that guy, Peter Benenson, he had to
Wait,
resign. It was a big scandal at the time that damaged Amnesty's credibility.
what you're saying about the violence reminds me, I'm reading a book by Lacerda right now called Nonviolence, A History Beyond the Myth, where he sort of lays out the inconsistency in what one could call the ideology of nonviolence.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a I mean, this was even an issue, like in the civil rights movement in the United States, where black nationalists or like more radical groups like the Black Panthers emerged, and they found themselves at odds with Martin Luther King, and the more mainstream civil rights movement using nonviolent civil disobedience.
Well, tellingly only
Complicated question.
tellingly only when Martin Luther King took a more radical turn did he then get assassinated.
Yeah, yeah, with the Poor People's Campaign and campaigning against the Vietnam War. I mean, it's very, and then liberals turned against him. Um, but that scandal that I mentioned, that really damaged Amnesty International's credibility. But it continued on. Peter Benenson had to resign, but the organization obviously continued on without him. And then it eventually widened its scope and got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, or it won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977, which is a whole other subject we don't have time to get into. I mean, the fact that war criminals like Henry Kissinger have gotten it. I mean, and then Alfred Nobel was like an arms dealer and whatnot. But anyway, but actually, there's another dark secret in Amnesty International's history that a lot of people don't know about. Speaking of the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers, involving the American branch. It was started in England, but it had Amnesty International obviously has branches all over the world. And one of the early founders of the American branch, a guy by the name of Lewis Kuttner, who was a human rights lawyer who'd been on cases actually defending the poet Ezra Pound, who was also a noted fascist. Um, Kuttner also represented the Dalai Lama in Tibet, which is a whole other topic.
Lacerdo gets into the Dalai Lama very in his book on
Yeah,
nonviolence.
well, the CI, it's
And
funny
and
because
Michael Prenti has a good article, I think, what is it, Friendly Feudalism or something
yeah,
like
I
that.
mean, the Dalai Lama is purported nonviolence. I mean, he was on the CIA payroll, and then the CIA was funding guerrillas, to wage
Mm.
an insurgency against the Chinese. I mean, unless they were nonviolent guerrillas, I don't think he really adhered to his own principles. But anyway, so let's just say this guy Kuttner, his choices for legal defense were highly questionable, though. Obviously, even the worst people do deserve legal defense. But anyway, he was on the National Advisory Council of the American branch of Amnesty International. And apparently, this is in the late 60s in 1969. Kuttner attended a speech at the University of Illinois given by Fred Hampton of the Chicago Black Panthers, who we've previously discussed on this podcast. And allegedly, in this speech that Hampton gave, Kuttner claimed that Hampton spoke about how the Panthers were armed, and they had a cache of weapons to be used in self-defense at his house and the party headquarters in Chicago. And it's said that Kuttner was in the audience during this speech, and he subsequently went and snitched and reported Hampton to the FBI about this, claiming that Fred Hampton was a psychopath who was ranting and raving, that he was called that in the speech, like he called for Nixon to be assassinated, and all this other bullshit that I don't. I mean, some of it might be true, but I don't think that Hampton would have said that publicly. I mean, people. I mean, there were other people in the Panthers like Eldridge Cleaver and whatnot who frequently made reckless statements, but I don't think that Fred Hampton was that stupid. But anyway, just a short time after Kuttner, basically informed on Hampton, the FBI and the Chicago police, they conducted this fatal execution style raid at Hampton's home where he was murdered, which was also facilitated by another FBI informant that they had inside the Panthers who drugged and incapacitated Hampton before the cops went in there, guns blazing. I actually recently watched the PBS series Eyes on the Prize, and there's a great episode of season 2 about the Hampton murder, and they interview the informant who was on the inside named William O'Neill. And he gives this confessional interview to that TV documentary. And then actually, that came out in 1990. Shortly after it aired, he actually killed himself. I guess he was deeply ashamed of what he'd done. And they've made movies about it since. There was a film, I think it was Judas and the Black Messiah, about that as well. Um, but this is pretty incredible that a lot of people don't know this Amnesty International. I mean, apparently in the 70s, also, according to according to the some of the JFK assassination files that were released, this same guy, Kuttner, he petitioned for the CIA for $250,000 to set up, I think, another NGO in Beijing that was to be staffed with, quote, completely our own people. And, Amnesty International has tried to distance themselves from this guy and in its history. They put out a statement downplaying like his importance, but he was one of their co-founders of the US branch. So, organizations like this, while they may have lots of good people within them, they are riddled with spooks and assets. And obviously, it's very unethical the way that intelligence agencies they infiltrate these human rights, aid work and relief agencies and whatnot. And for whatever good work they may do, and they do some, a group like Amnesty International, it's susceptible, because because these organizations have such benevolent stated intentions, people don't want to think about how they might be being used for nefarious purposes and how, they, because they come off as so innocuous, that people just assume that take them at face value. And that, I mean, this is exactly why they would be ripe for, being infiltrated by intelligence agencies. And also, but even if you look at their very foundations, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are the perfect examples of like ties to intelligence and the foreign policy establishment. I mean, all these groups, if you look at their advisory boards, there's all kinds of foreign policy wonks sitting on them, who are also policymakers, and so there's a big overlap between the Beltway blob and these human rights NGOs. And, very frequently, I mean, Amnesty International, despite, accurate reports it may issue, it has also frequently corroborated disinformation spread by the US government in order to launch its illegal wars. I mean, a perfect example is a very famous case during the Gulf War when there were claims made that Saddam Hussein's troops during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, that they were going into hospitals and ripping premature babies out of incubators in maternity wards in Kuwaiti hospitals, and then throwing them on the floor and leaving them to die. I mean, this terrible, if that's true, that would have been a definition of a war crime. But the problem, the source of this dubious and graphic claim was this young 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl who gave testimony before the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Congress. She said her name was Naira, and she claimed that she had been a volunteer nurse at a Kuwaiti hospital. And, her claims were repeated and accepted as fact by the media. And even George H.W. Bush, the president at the time, used it as justification for the U.S. military action taken against Iraq. And it later turned out that, surprise, she was not at all what she claimed to be. She was not a nurse. And she was, in fact, the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. at the time. And she and her father, the ambassador, were both members of the ruling al-Sabah family. And this atrocity propaganda was part of a wider public relations, astroturfing campaign carried out by the Kuwaiti government in exile at the time. And Amnesty, initially, they corroborated these unsubstantiated claims that she made about the babies being ripped out of incubators. And they even published a report about these supposed killings. Then they issued a correction trying to say, blaming it on the Bush administration, but their complicity was clear. And even if they had been manipulated, they went on with this unquestioningly, and it just really exposed their role, despite whatever legitimate work they do. And that's apart from the fact that the whole Gulf War to begin with. I mean, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq at the time, April Glaspie, she'd given Saddam the green light to go into Kuwait, and then they subsequently threw him under the bus. She'd met with him shortly before and stated in transcripts, that the U.S. had no opinion on the dispute between Kuwait and Iraq. And Saddam interpreted that as tacit approval. But I mean, that's a conversation for another time. But I did want to play just a brief clip of 60 Minutes did a little report on Naira. So I want to show this.
There have been re-examinations. Among the names that have reappeared is Naira. It's been said many times, in war, the first casualty is truth. Does it apply to the Gulf War? The fact of Saddam Hussein's aggression is beyond dispute. But what about the campaign to commit American troops to liberate Kuwait? To get Americans, perhaps any people, to support a war in a place millions barely heard of, certain buttons must be pressed. In the run-up to the Gulf War, one image, one presence touched American hearts and minds like no other. It was this 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl identified only as Naira.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Naira, and I just came out of Kuwait. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
Naira was testifying before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, but in fact, she was testifying before the American people, and her story mesmerized the nation and the world. Dead babies, brutal, pillaging Iraqi monsters. It was powerful stuff, according to Congressman John Porter of Illinois, co-chairman of the caucus.
I got feedback from the president. I happened to be over at the White House the afternoon, later in the evening, after the afternoon of the hearings, and the president said that he had seen it on CNN, and that he was shocked at some of the things that he had heard.
And they were thrown out of the incubators.
President Bush repeated the incubator story at least 10 times in the following weeks.
Babies pulled from incubators and scattered like firewood across the floor.
There was plenty of evidence of Iraqi brutality, but the incubator story became almost a rallying cry. It had presidential confirmation and the confirmation of Amnesty International, which published a report after Naira testified, quoting her and claiming 312 babies were killed when Iraqi troops pulled them from their incubators. Then, a rather embarrassed Amnesty retracted its report. In London, spokesman Sean Stiles said, as hard as they tried, they could not confirm it.
We spoke to well over a dozen doctors of different nationalities who had been in Kuwait at the time, and they couldn't stand the story up, and it became quite clear to us that credible medical opinion was that this didn't happen.
And it wasn't just...
So I think you get the point, but that's just a perfect example of, the sort of function that they end up serving.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how I think that video and what you were saying before about how these human rights organizations will do some legitimate work is that there's this preying on people's emotions and their compassion and getting that, because then if you're like, oh, for example, with like, I mean, you saw it with October 7th, there was all the stories about Hamas burning the babies, and then it came out that that wasn't true. Like, you're like, oh, well, this could be some sort of Western propaganda. People react to you like, you sort of monster. What, you think it's right to burn babies? Or when you say like, oh, this Human Rights Watch, serve dubious aims. Be People react to you like you're some sort of a monster because of this veneer of morality that has been put on these organizations.
Yeah, and the use of babies specifically, I mean, that goes back to World War One. There were stories, I think in like German propaganda about, or British propaganda, I can't remember, about Belgian babies, on bayonets and stuff. I mean, it's just,
It goes back further than that, actually. I remember reading, like, I think that they tried to say, like, I can't remember, it was very long time ago with conflicts between Jews and Christians that I think that I can't remember, I think they tried to say that the, I can't remember if it was the Christians or the Jews, which one said which, but they tried to say one group would eat babies, ritualistically eat babies, or sacrifice babies.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was British propaganda that I was thinking of with it was German. The German soldiers were putting in Belgium. They had babies on bayonets, and it was completely untrue. It's atrocity propaganda, especially with the subject of babies, is like the most innocent thing you can think of. Is just that's the buttons that you can push with people to get them to react emotionally and stop thinking critically about whether something is true or not. And obviously the exploitation of children using a young teenage girl who happens to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador and the ruling family. It's there have been people that actually have tried to look up like where she is now and what she's doing, but it's unclear. Um, but another place, that we saw this sort of thing happen with children too. I mean, there was this young Syrian girl, Bana Al Abed, that they were using for in the Syrian war, that the Syrian opposition was using to make all kinds of crazy claims about atrocities supposedly being committed by the Assad government. And they utilized a child for exploitative purposes. I mean, it's very unclear how much she was doing, using social media on her own. I mean, she was very young, very young girl. Um, and, during the course of the Syrian war, we saw a similar sort of operation emerge and also using fake first responders or aid workers for war propaganda with the white helmets, who many people are probably familiar with. But in case you're not, they're a purported civil society organization and humanitarian group that emerged during the Syrian civil war, which is really a proxy war like Ukraine, of course. But and they're, in war zones like in Syria, there were many humanitarian groups on the ground doing uh, humanitarian aid work. The problem is that the white helmets specifically, not only did they travel with like a film crew everywhere they went, but they were also operating exclusively in territory held by the Syrian opposition, which mainly consisted of jihadist groups, and they were clearly partners with the sectarian insurgency that was waging this holy war against the Syrian government, which was eventually ousted in December of last year. But when they emerged in 2014, from the beginning, it was very obvious to many people that they were not who they appeared to be. But they put out, these very slick videos. There was even a Netflix documentary that won an Academy Award about them. I mean, it's just incredible at the time. People were making all these jokes like, and the Oscar goes to Al Qaeda, you know, it was unbelievable. I mean, they also got nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But this supposed civil defense group, you know, they went around, you know, with the hard hats and but they were embedded with the specifically Al Nusra Front, you know, which was the Syrian affiliate of Al Qaeda, and working directly alongside them. And then, you know, videos started to come out, you know, suggesting that they were even militants. Some of them were even militants themselves. I mean, there were videos that came out where like terrorists would execute a Syrian soldier, and then a few moments later, the white helmets would come and then they would drag the body away. I saw many videos like that. When they captured certain towns, some of them were caught, you know, celebrating with guns, you know, chanting Allahu Akbar. Um, and, you know, it was clearly that they were not impartial. And again, even some of them may have been moonlighting as terrorists themselves. And they were clearly also, in many cases, facilitating the atrocities that the terrorist groups were committing. A lot of journalists that went to Syria, you know, they interviewed civilians that were saying, you know, Syrian civilians were saying that they weren't helping anybody. They were exclusively like acting as, when they were acting as medics, it was to treat the militants if they were injured. They were not a real, you know, civil society or a civic defense group. Um, and if you look into their organization, I mean, they were founded by a former British intelligence officer and Blackwater mercenary whose name was James Le Mesurier. And he was employed by a Western intelligence contractor called ARK, or Analysis, Research, and Knowledge is what it stood for. And it got funding from the UK Foreign Office and the State Department, which gave them its whole branding and equipment. And they, you know, they went around with this film crew, very selectively filming their activities in war zones. There were lots of videos that went viral of, you know, of them like pulling babies out of bomb buildings and rubble and stuff. But they also, you know, kind of gave themselves away. There was an instance where they did, you know, there were, you know, at the time there's lots of, you know, viral internet video trends, and one of, you know, there was an ice bucket challenge and all that. But there was one video trend at the time where people were filming themselves, you know, posing as a mannequin, you know, with the, you know, still, but with a video called the mannequin challenge, which many people may remember. And the White Helmets, some of their members, they thought it appropriate to do this in a war zone. And they put this video out.
It reminds me of the dancing nurses during COVID a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so inappropriate. I mean, it's like if you're actually working in a war zone rescuing people, uh, this is just completely inappropriate. And the problem is if you watch this video, I'll show it in a second. It looks not that much unlike their actual footage, you know, that's in the White Helmets documentary and the footage they put out of them supposedly rescuing civilians. I mean, here I'll just play it. People can judge for themselves. So yeah, I mean it does, I mean with the added sound that they added, it's just like their purported documentary footage. I mean and this happened, and it caused a pretty big disaster for them. I mean I think they had to like issue an apology, and it got a lot of backlash obviously, but um it kind of exposed how produced their whole PR campaign was. And the founder, James Le Mesurier, he later died under mysterious circumstances in Turkey, a country which, of course, supported the terrorist uprising. He fell off a balcony in Istanbul.
Of course.
Of course, led many people to believe he was whacked. The Turkish authorities, they said it was a suicide, but there was clearly some sort of foul play involved. It may have even involved his wife or something. But like when the white helmets came out, they were everywhere. And I knew people, like I had like coworkers that like gave them money and stuff. And I was like trying to tell them like, that's not a real relief organization. If you want to help civilians, you can find actual legitimate ones. Like that one is very questionable. Clearly has ties to the opposition. The opposition is very clearly, become very Wahhabized and is a terror, affiliated. I mean, they were operating exclusively with the militant opposition. They were not operating in areas under the Syrian government. They were the whole notion. I mean, these humanitarian relief work. Obviously, like relief workers, they have to work with both. In war zones, they have to work with both sides, in order to get access to the civilians that are under threat, or who may be hungry or whatever it is. But they're not supposed to be siding with one over the other. So that's a dead giveaway. And I wrote an article. I wrote a series of articles about the CIA support for Chechen separatism in Covert Action magazine, which people can read. The second part of the series I did focused on this guy named Fred Cuny, who is another perfect example of someone who overstepped those bounds of impartiality. He's kind of an obscure figure, but I think people should know about him as well, because he was somebody that was clearly like an example of a intelligence operative who had infiltrated nonprofit work and humanitarian relief. I mean, he was a disaster relief specialist. That's what he purported to be. He started out actually working exclusively in like natural disasters and like countries devastated by earthquakes or droughts or whatever it was. And then at a certain point, he transitioned to war zones. When he became an operative is sort of unclear. It might have been from the very beginning. It might have been when he switched to working in war zones. But he is a perfect example, because he even garnered accusations from his fellow relief workers because he was so of being a spy, because he was so brazenly like overstepping the bounds of neutrality, to the point where he was like, for example, when he was working in the Balkans and Yugoslavia during the 90s, he was taking out newspaper op-eds criticizing the Serbs, and then like calling for NATO intervention. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, and actually he in the Syrian war and in Libya and in Iraq as well, in these numerous humanitarian interventions that the U.S. has done, one of the ways that they do it is they impose what's called a no-fly zone. And in Syria, it was really dangerous because there was Russian troops present in Syria. So a no-fly zone would have probably meant a direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. And Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, was actually calling for that. So people were really worried about World War III. But the person that actually kind of came up with that formula of imposing no-fly zones was this guy, Fred Cuny. And he did that in first in the Gulf War. Uh, actually, he in order to relocate the Kurds that were being uh, targeted by Saddam's forces, in order to transport them to Iraqi Kurdistan, he uh, he worked as a humanitarian relief specialist directly with the U.S. military to impose a no-fly zone. So these Kurds could be moved to this enclave that has since been a big area of strategic importance for the U.S. in the Middle East. And then that formula was later replicated in the Balkans and in Libya, the NATO intervention there, and then they wanted to do it in Syria, but it was such a dangerous situation that they couldn't. But this guy, Fred Cuny, was a perfect example, and he later ended up getting killed in Chechnya. But I'll put a link I'll put a link to my article so people can read about him as well. But the White Helmets, all these people. I mean, there's a whole apparatus that Western imperialism uses under the guise of human rights to facilitate its interventions, and it has this propaganda PR arm, and that's what a lot of these civil society and human rights NGOs, the function they end up serving. And yes, it's not to say that everyone that works for them or everyone involved is really in the know about this or really understands what their function is. They do some good work. They do bring relief to people. I mean, even in Gaza, they do some good work, but they become a instrument, intentionally or unintentionally, to facilitate these interventions and Western imperialism. And that's why, this guy, Alfred de Zayas, who worked at the UN, calls it the human rights industry. It really is like a human rights industrial complex that is really intricately tied to Western imperial aims around the world, and it gives it this veneer of this facade of because you don't question it. I mean, it's like rights groups. I mean, unfortunately, a country like Israel, like when they accuse Hamas, like human rights, like the UN human rights or refugee organizations of being embedded with Hamas or whatever, they're kind of taking advantage of that sort of kernel of truth. Because there are many instances of like in Syria, for example, of human rights groups working with terrorist organizations, basically. Um, but like aid, Israel is exploiting that. I mean, human rights groups, they have to work with bad actors. They have to work, like if they're working in a war zone, they have to work with or get permission from a government that may be committing atrocities, or they may have to work alongside really bad um, terrorist groups or whatever in order to access the innocent civilians that are caught up in it. But they can very frequently be subverted and manipulated, and it's very unethical, the way that like spy agencies like infiltrates these groups and they have operatives in them. Um, That's
Yeah,
a big problem, but people can't be naive about it.
should probably be wrapping up, but I just think that, people tend to believe these human rights organizations because they present themselves as being apolitical. But it's like I've talked about the abstract expressionism and the way that was used by the CIA during the Cold War. A lot of times, what appears to be apolitical, it isn't actually apolitical, it merely appears apolitical because it is conforming to the dominant politics and ideology of the society from which it's coming from.
Absolutely. That's a very succinct way of putting it. And I would say that the things that appear to be the most apolitical are usually the most political. Because it's something that, like people, and you can't blame people for falling for it too. Like people who giving money to the white helmets. They hear about this selfless organization of these people volunteering to work in a war zone to save civilians being killed. They're not thinking, they just want to help. They want to give money, help people, innocent people. They're not thinking about how something like this could be used and taken advantage of, and in the worst cases working with, terrorist groups that are executing civilians. And I mean, there were in Syria, there were lots of real organization, civil defense groups, I'm sure, doing legitimate work. They were not right there when militants are executing people and then carrying the body away. And that's facilitating an atrocity. They're helping them basically. And the white helmets are just like the apotheosis of like this whole um propaganda industry that really emerged with somebody like Fred Cuny, who I think was one of the sort of like unsung heroes of like people who like uh kind of perfected that propaganda PR campaigns. That like Samantha Power like knew him, and she's like the biggest uh uh propagandist of like the responsibility to protect. And in her memoir she reminisced about her time with him. I mean, these like foreign policy ghouls, and the human rights industry are just uh, intricately connected with one another. And yeah, this is one of the ways that you can expose the real nature of Western imperialism. But yeah, we should be wrapping up. I think this was a good discussion. I mean, there's so much more we didn't even really talk about USAID, but that's another. I mean, Fred Cuny was a USAID contractor. So, um, yeah, I mean, they have a history of working with terrorist groups. They worked with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And actually, if people want to know about USAID, just watch the Costa Gavras film State of Siege, which is based on a real case. Of this that sort of epitomized the USAID. Uh, this guy Dan Mitrione, he was a USAID contractor who worked in Uruguay, and he was sent there by the CIA to under using USAID as his cover to train the police in counterinsurgency techniques, and that involved basically rounding up homeless people and torturing them. Um,
Wow.
and then he ended up this USAID guy, Dan Mitrione, he ended up getting kidnapped by Marxist guerrillas, Tupamaros, and they eventually executed him. And Costa Gavras made a great film called State of Siege about it. But anyway, yeah, we should be wrapping up. This was a great discussion, I think. Please leave comments and don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll put links to a lot of the things we discussed. And yeah, our YouTube channel, it's Captive Minds Pod. If you're watching us on there, we have a Substack. It's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. Uh, and you can also follow us on X. It's Captive Minds X. Shaenah, do you have any final thoughts?
I do not today.
Okay, well,
Thank you. Thank you, listeners.
yeah, thanks for putting up with me rambling. Yeah, we'll be back for another episode soon. And stay tuned for another episode of Captive Minds. Thanks for joining us.